In our previous projects, we've declared variables and assigned values to them, such as in this case x, y, z, and ABC, and we assigned the values of 12 and 5. And we could use those in a mathematical calculation, and we would end up getting 60 in the text box for this piece of code. When we declare the variables, it has set aside a piece of memory and assigned the variable name that we gave it and assigned the value that we gave that variable, and that value might change over time. But a variable can only contain one value, and the variables are not linked in any way other than through our code. Arrays allow us to, in essence, have a variable that contains multiple values. And I declare array just as I would declare any other data type variable, but I declare it as an array, and I can declare it as a new array object. And then I can assign values to that array based on index numbers, and the index numbers occur inside of square brackets. So I can assign xyz sub 0, refer to that as xyz sub 0 or element 0, and assign it a value of 12. And then I can assign element 3 a value of 5. And then what's happening in memory is it's setting aside xyz, and it can contain multiple values that are referenced by the index number. In this case, 1 and 2, I haven't assigned anything, and so it contains an undefined value. But I can reference these values in a mathematical equation just like we did with variables by accessing the index numbers. So in this case, output underscore txt.text equals xyz sub 0 times xyz sub 3. That's going to be 12 times 5, converting that to a string, and 60 is what will go into that text field. I can also declare an array and populate it at the same time. So in this case, I have xyz as an array, and I can say it equals a new array, and then in parentheses, I can specify the values. So here I have 4 numbers, and they are comma separated, and now what's going to happen is it's going to create xyz out in RAM, and assign the values of 12, 0, 0, and 5 to index 0, 1, 2, and 3. And again, I can reference those in an equation. Alternatively, I can shorten that a little bit by saying variable xyz colon array equals, and rather than saying new array, I can just use square brackets and put the values comma separated inside those square brackets. That does the exact same thing. And I'm not limited to using numbers. I could create an array that contains names or any type of string value, and the strings would have to be put into quotes since they're literal strings, but again, they are comma separated. I could also do Boolean values. I can do integers. I can do numbers. I can even do objects. And again, I can reference those in an equation using the index numbers. So we've seen that we can declare an array and we can populate it separately. We can also populate it using the new array and putting comma separated items inside the parentheses, and we can use square brackets and put comma separated items inside those square brackets. And the result for all 3 of these is I would get an array called student, and element 0 would be Bob, element 1 would be Sam, and element 2 would be Ann. So those are the 3 ways that we can declare and populate an array. I can at any time in my code later add more values, so I could much later in my code say student sub 15 equals Bill. I can also assign values to an array using the push method. So I initially create my array, I populate elements 0, 1, and 2, and then I can push another value onto that array using .push and specifying in the parentheses the element or elements that I want to add at the end. In this case, I'm adding only 1, but I could add more than 1. I could make those commas separated, and it would add, if I had 2, it would add them as elements 3 and 4. And then another option is to use the unshift method. Works the same way as push, except it's going to add them at the beginning. And again, if I had multiple items that are comma separated in the parentheses, it would add those as separate elements starting at the beginning, starting at 0, and it pushes everything downward. So in this case, when I add Tammy using unshift, Bob, Sam, Ann, and Frank all move down 1 element. Another way of adding elements is using the Splice command, which will insert elements at a designated element. So in this case, with the Splice command, I have Bob, Sam, and Ann as the 3 elements of my array, and then with the splice, I'm adding at element 1 That's what that first number is. It's the element location. The second number, 0, is how many elements I want to delete. We can also use the splice method to delete items. In this case, I don't want to delete any. I simply want to insert. And so anything after those two numbers is what would be inserted. So I'm inserting Jim and Doris at element 1, and everything else moves down. So Sam and Ann would become elements 3 and 4. Jim and Doris are elements 1 and 2. I can also retrieve items out of an array in various ways. So we've already seen that we can reference an item using the name of the array and the element number. So in this case, I can assign variable A the string value of whatever's in student 2, which in this case would be Sam. There's also a pop method, which is sort of the opposite of the push method, in that it pulls the last item out of the array. So when I use the pop command, I'm going to take whatever this last item is, which is Frank, and assign it to the variable B. And in doing that, it's going to remove Frank out of the array. So what I'm left with is this array down here in the bottom left, where I now have 4 items: Tammy, Bob, Sam, and Ann. We have the unshift method that allows us to add items at the top of an array. The shift method removes items at the top of an array. So in this case, student.shift would take the element Tammy out of my array at the very top, place it in variable C, and remove it from the array. So now I am left in this bottom middle view of Bob, Sam, and Ann. And then we've used the splice command to add items in. We can also use the splice command to remove items. And so here, student.splice is going to remove the element at item 1, and the number of elements I want to remove is just 1. So it's going to pull Sam out, and I'm left with Bob and Ann. Let's take a look at using this in a Flash project. So I have a project here in which we have a input box, and I've just got some comma delimited numbers there we're going to use as a default, a calculate button, and when I click the calculate button, I want to get the sum of all these numbers, the average of those numbers, and whatever the low and high values are. By using an array, it becomes very easy to do this, and it doesn't matter how many values I have here. I could have 3, I could have 14, I could have 500, and my code's not going to change. So let me just run this. I'm going to go to the control menu, test my movie, and when I click calculate, I'm told the sum is 166, the average is 11.86, and I basically rounded that to 2 decimal places, and the low value is 2 and the high is 24. Now it's kind of hard to go through and check the results without a calculator. Let's do something a little bit easier here. I'm going to change this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And when I click calculate, the sum is now 15. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 is indeed 15. The average is 3. So 15 divided by 5 is 3. My low value is 1. My high value is 5. If I did 10, 20, and 30, total is 60. The average is 20. The low value is 10. The high is 30. Let's look at the code of how we do this using an array. So I have an event listener for my button, and then the function that it calls, and I'm creating an array called new array, and then I'm going to assign to that array the values of our text box, which is named values_txt. That's the input box of the comma separated items, and I'm using a text method called split. And inside the parentheses for split, I'm specifying a comma. And basically what the split method does is it takes the text and it separates it by whatever delimiter I have specified here into an array of however many values it would take. Then I've got a value called XYZ, which is simply going to determine how many values were put into that array. So that's the length of the array. So arrays have a length property. Then I've got some variables here. I've got sum, which is going to equal 0 to start with, AVG for average. High is going to equal the first element of my array, and low is going to equal the first element of my array as well. And here's where the power of the array comes in, because with a for loop, I can now calculate what the sum is and look up the high and the low values, regardless of how large that array is. Whether it's 2 values, whether it's 2,000 values. Each time through the array, I'm going to look at, or I'm going to go through the array from starting with I equals 0 until I hit the end of the array using that length value, xyz. I'm going to increment it by 1 each time through the array. And each time through the array, I'm going to increment the sum by whatever element I is. So the first time through, I'm going to increment sum by my array sub 0. Second time through, my array sub 1. Next time, my array sub 2, and so forth. And then each time through, I'm looking at whatever the value is of high, which is going to start at my array sub 0. And let's say element 10 is higher than that. So if high is less than my array sub 10, I'm going to replace high with my array sub 10. So each time through the loop, it's going to compare the current element with the high and swap it if necessary, and I do the same thing for the low and swap it if necessary. After that, I'm simply going to display the sum, display the high, display the low, and then I'm going to calculate the average by taking the sum and dividing it by the length. And then to round it off, I'm going to multiply it by 100 and use math.round, and then divide that by 100. That'll give me 2 decimal places and convert that to a string. So that is the power of an array. Think about if we did this with 100 variables, it would be a mess writing that code, and the chances of us making a mistake would probably be pretty high. We'd likely leave out one variable. And we wouldn't have the flexibility in terms of changing the number of variables that easily. Arrays are extremely powerful then for much more complicated applications as well as for games.